Today's expert is a domestic violence specialist. And more. She is coming in from Las Vegas, Nevada, where I think she runs one of the largest domestic violence services ever. She was giving me statistics saying that her area has twice the, here she is, amount of domestic violence situations in the country. Let me get her. Yes, third time's the charm. I hope so. Now let me see if I could get her in here. Why isn't it working? Oh my God. Now I can't, geez. Sorry guys, nothing is happening. I can't get Liz in here, and I don't know if it's my phone. Let me take this off. Here, and we're going to be talking about family court and systems and what systems can do better for domestic violence survivors. Ah, yes, finally. God, I was like, my phone case is not letting me push the button. Anyhow, anyway, thank you so much, Liz. So before we even get started, I'm not just going to babble on about what we talked about beforehand, but how effective is family court when it comes to helping families where domestic violence takes place?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's varying degrees of family court's ability to do things, but when we see sort of an intersectionality with poverty, high risk domestic violence, we are seeing a court that in our jurisdiction is fairly ineffective in navigating what's really happening.
Yeah, and we're going to jump deeply into that now that the camera and everything else is working. So Liz, before we even start, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, so I have been running SafeNest, which is a large domestic and sexual violence nonprofit here in Las Vegas for almost the last 10 years. I did not come to this work through that lens. My entire career before that is in youth development, mostly with the Girl Scouts and with the YMCA.
Oh, really?
Um, yeah, but when you live in, I always tell people I'm a field where people are literally murdered, and it's less stressful than the Girl Scout cookie sale. So there is that. Phenomenal program, great female leadership. The cookie sale for staff is a stressful event, but anyway, I've been doing this for 10 years. Las Vegas, there's a huge need here for a safety net. So I moved here to be the CEO of Girl Scouts, did that for 3 years, and then moved into the domestic violence work and have just come to love it.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting how you love it? I love what we do. People are always like, oh my gosh, it must be so horrible. I'm like, no, it's amazing because you meet the most amazing people, right? They're the ones who are
Yeah.
the targets.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, within the space of domestic violence, it's hard for us to feel this way sometimes, but it's a fairly juvenile movement. Girl Scouts has been around for 100 years. The YMCA has been around for 150 plus years. Really, domestic violence has only been around for 50, and most nonprofits in the space are coming up on their 50-year anniversary, kind of give or take a couple of years. We're still a pretty new movement relative to large movements that have made great change. It doesn't mean, that the future the horizon is rosy. I think the reality is those of us that are leading this movement, like yourself and others in different ways, have a responsibility to say, what will the next 50 years garner in the space? Because where we sit today is still pretty ineffective.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that being, and I didn't even think about that it is a pretty new movement since the 70s, right? Because
Yeah.
before that, it was like marriage, you do whatever you want in your own home and there's nothing you can do about it.
Yeah, it always surprises people. I tell them domestic violence actually became illegal in the United States in 1920, right? But illegal is relative to what is the actual repercussion to doing that behavior, right? It's illegal to wear sunglasses that are an inch beyond your face in California, largely ignored,
Right.
right? Because the police aren't out there supervising sunglass usage. Domestic violence in the 1970s really went from a private to a public matter. And that was mostly due to second wave feminism pushing policy change. It was also due to a specific case, Tracy Thurman, city of Torrington was stabbed 13 times by her husband while a policeman sat in his car and watched. That in its of itself, it didn't change. What changed was Tracy did not die in that incident. She was brave enough to go forward, press charges, and get a $2 million plus lawsuit, which at that time, late 1970s, is record breaking. This whole thing garnered public attention in a way domestic violence had not. She had asked for help from police. She had done, like by today's standards, all of the things we ask survivors to do and could not get any help. And then for a police officer to sit there and watch her be stabbed and for her to win that money, that really changed. Like all of a sudden, police were like, ooh, we need to do something about this. And then there was another sort of research study out of Minneapolis that said women are safer when the husbands are actually taken to jail, instead of a policeman on the scene being like, well, why don't you guys have a nice dinner and just figure it out?
Right.
And so those two things really changed the face of the movement, and then policy started coming, and then Violence Against Women's Act came in effect just over 30 plus years ago. And that largely was kind of the end of that beginning revolution in the space of domestic violence. And we have largely been doing the same thing for 30 plus years.
Yeah. But now there's so many services. How effective have the services been for survivors?
Well, if we, depending on what metric you use, which we use FBI data at SafeNest, we have not seen a persistent drop in domestic violence rates, and certainly not in domestic violence homicides. In fact, we're going to talk for about a half an hour. Over the course of that conversation, 400 plus people in the United States will be victims of domestic violence.
Yeah.
And so we really haven't seen what I think the second wave feminist movement really hoped for, which would have been an elimination of partner abuse, domestic violence in the way that we all know it. And we haven't seen that.
So what do you think is the issue? I mean, we're pouring so much energy into helping survivors.
Yeah. So, what I talk a lot about in Las Vegas is the snowball, right? I have, within our community, we had at least known 17,000 school-age children that were on sites of DV arrests last year. So 17,000 kids highly traumatized by an arrest and DV going on in their home for who knows how long, right? That 17,000 is only where arrests were made. Our police only arrest 30% of the time on a DV call because it's got to elevate to probable cause. So we say 20,000 to make the math easy. That's 60,000 to 70,000 children in a house police responded to where domestic violence was taking place last year in some form. 70,000 kids a year. 76% of kids will repeat the cycle of domestic violence as an abuser or as a survivor, right? Or as both, right? We see a lot of mutual combat as well. That is a snowball. That is a snowball every single year, and it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So we're disregarding childhood trauma as an understanding of future violence, and yet it is the best predictor of future violence is childhood trauma, which many of your listeners, and I'm sure you are familiar with adverse childhood experience scores. As soon as kids hit 4 or more, which is most of society's walking around with about 1.5 adverse childhood experience scores, scale of 10, 4 or more is really where we start to see that cliff of intravenous drug use, rape, a perpetrator as well as a victim, sexual assault, all of the other sort of social ills can be linked back to this. But yet, what are we doing about kids that are growing up in adverse childhood experiences? And I know a lot of your listeners are going through toxic divorces. One of the things that we talk about a lot at SafeNest is take that adverse childhood experience. You can just Google it, take it for yourself for the time before 18, but then take it for your kids.
Mm-hmm.
And really understanding the trauma that is happening within your child's life will be really helpful in figuring out, what needs to be the path forward. And there is an antidote for a high bad childhood experience score, 4 or higher. And the antidote is building kids with everybody thinks resiliency. We talk a lot more about hope. And hope, scientifically defined, is believing my future does not have to be the same as my present or my past, and that I have the power to change that. Filling kids' lives with that dynamic, is really important, and particularly as you have great listeners that are going through these toxic divorces. How are we filling our kids' life with hope? Because my children went through my divorce, which I would not describe as toxic, but it certainly was traumatizing for them. How do they realize there's still beauty in relationships, beauty in human contact, beauty in taking the risk to love? And so much of that can be lost on our kids, right? And that leaves a pretty hopeless child when they're starting to navigate middle school and high school and relationships. So there's a lot of stuff in there. But people ask me all the time, if there's one thing you could do about domestic violence, I would say, look, take all the money you give me, all the money you give agencies like mine around the country, invest it in traumatized kids in the schools. Just assume every child has some trauma, and build out an entirely different hope curriculum, invest in school counselors in a way that they can meet the kids' needs, invest in trauma-informed education, trauma-informed educators, and make our schools not only paradigms of education, but these shifting ability to build hope in our children, so that no child, no matter what the circumstances they're in, is leaving school with an idea that they can forge their own path and they are not confined by the realities of the world they grew up in.
Yeah, because we know that we gravitate towards what's familiar,
Yeah.
and that's what's normal. And so the cycle just continues and continues. Now,
Yeah.
I had seen something that you had that said that we also don't deal with abusers when we only deal with survivors. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about
Yeah, absolutely. So the movement, when it sort of bifurcated in the 1980s, really took two paths. The nonprofit complex, as we call it, sort of got deemed the place for survivor services. So that looks like shelter, hotline, court advocacy, the great work your organization does, the great work SafeNest does. But largely, then the feminist movement of the time pushed on the criminal legal system to be the punisher of the abusive partner.
Mhm.
I think we can look back now, in this time that we're in, and say that while at that time, yes, we needed police to start to take domestic violence seriously, has the pendulum swung too far? And is there more work that we need to do before criminal legal system is involved, or despite the criminal legal system being involved for the abusers? Because our research at SafeNest is that 70% of our survivors return to their abusers. And that, there isn't a lot of great peer-reviewed, evidence-based stuff out there around, like exact return rates, because largely survivors are like, well, if I tell you I return, you somehow treat me with shame and blame, right? That's the number one question people ask me, is why does she stay? And I'm always saying, the number one question I have is, why did he think it was okay to beat the crap out of her? Like, let's have that conversation, right? Or why did he think it was okay to drum his fingers on the table every night and explain to her that he was going to kill her and never touch her, but terrify her, terrify the children, terrify everybody? And I gender this conversation, but I certainly know women can also be abusers. We certainly work with male victims of abuse and gender non-binary individuals that are stuck in a space as well. So while my language can be gendered, I have a full recognition that this is not just a female male issue.
Yeah.
But we don't talk enough about how are we supporting, not excusing, but understanding the behavior of abusers and how it got to this space. Certainly abuse does not run like there's one kind of abuse. It's a spectrum. And most domestic violence are sitting in that unhealthy, coercive control, but not lethal domestic violence. When I talk about working with abusers, we really have to start to, as a society, understand there is non-lethal domestic violence, which is abhorrent but solvable. There is lethal domestic violence, and that the connection there to mass shooters and cop killers cannot be understated. And those are the folks that are murdering their survivors. That space is different, and that space needs to be dealt with in the court system. I'm not saying there shouldn't be resources in jail. In fact, we help provide some of those, but that is incarceration approach is appropriate. that
Hmm.
promotes DV. And we run domestic violence perpetrator classes. I have got participants in those classes that have pushed their wife or partner and they've maybe fallen back and sprained a wrist. Not appropriate at all, not excusing that behavior. But I've also had folks sitting in that class that have pinned their wife to the garage, broken both of her legs, and left her there,
Hmm.
and denied for weeks that they were driving the vehicle that did that. These are not the same, but the courts have largely, the criminal court now has largely does not have a mechanism to deal with these things differently, and
Hmm.
sort of garners everybody to abusive partner programming, in which you get a very mixed bag of abusive partners. And yes, that's a very fair question. What's the effect of that on that cohort of abusers if they're not, they're not at all aligned in their abuse? So when you're teaching that class, how do you teach to the different levels of abuse? That is complicated. And I would say probably part of the reason why domestic batters intervention programs, which happen across the country, even when we look at the broad research that's been done, and there's a lot, there's not only one-off research, there's macro research, there's a ton of research in that space. None of it can really point to that it's incredibly effective. It can
Hmm.
point to that it doesn't do more harm, but there is, even longitudinal studies around this that don't show, okay, these abusers were in this program, that we somehow saw some miraculous outcome, that they never engage with the criminal legal system again. That largely is not available because that data doesn't exist, because that paradigm doesn't exist. So these classes are really a way for the courts to say, hey, we want you to go learn something. We're going to do this instead of incarcerate, which, okay, do no more harm. Hopefully folks get some realization around their abusive behavior, but it largely isn't changing the paradigm. So here we sit, 50 years after the kind of the birth of the movement, 30 plus years after Violence Against Women's Act, which was really that landmark legislation, with no real change.
Yeah. So I had said to you, and we only have like 5 more minutes because I have a client
Oh
at
my
lunch.
gosh.
But so our clients have gotten out of the relationship, so they're out and they're going through the family court system.
Yeah.
From your experience, when someone's gotten out and they're starting this process, are there things that you see that are effective for them to ask for from the court at the very beginning? I'm thinking in terms of specific mental health services, because they are going to have to continue a co-parenting relationship most of the time.
Yeah, absolutely. So co-parenting with an abuser is incredibly hard, and we know this. One of the things I always ask the attorneys when we sort of provide support is make sure the judge understands a child witnessing abuse in their brain, the exact same chemical reaction as if they are being abused.
Mhm.
I think family court overwhelmingly sorts to say, well, he or she didn't touch the child. And
Mhm.
I'm going, that's not the point. Their brain reaction is the same. So it's as if they're being abused. Make sure your judges understand that. That's not for you to, but make sure your attorney gets that in the record. That's really helpful. I also think judges sort of have a bias towards a linear story.
Mm.
So if you have abuse in your relationship, document out for yourself the linear story. Judges are thinking, oh, she's all over the place and he's over here, telling this very succinct linear story. Yes, because he hasn't experienced what she's experienced. But also be prepared. You understand your abuser more than the court ever will. Understand how he is going or she is going to use the court systems to manipulate the legal system to get what they want, and play chess. This is so you're spending a lot of mental time saying, okay, the court's saying this, he's going to hear or she's going to hear, and my guess is they're going to interpret it this way. Play offense as much as you can and head that stuff off. But I always remind our survivors, you know your abuser the best. So put yourself in their shoes and try to think through how they're going to do this stuff. and then try to get a step ahead of it. I know it sounds incredibly like, why can't the court just see this? But honestly, they don't. They really don't. I see our judges really believe that that if one party has something massively to gain over the other party, particularly if a woman is fighting for custody, they see then the domestic violence abuse is probably either fabricated or, expanded so that she's got a leg to stand on, and then they seem to disregard it. Photograph your abuse, write it in a diary, tell a friend. You don't have to call a place like SafeNest. If you're in California, there are places you can call and do a police report without actually doing a police report, but document, and encrypt that documentation. You can simply just email it to yourself so it has a date stamp on it, so that because he's going to say, or she's going to say, they made it up. You're going to go, nope, here's my inbox, here's my sent, here's the dut. You're going to have that kind of stuff, and you have to think through it from that. If you've got bruises, take pictures of the bruises. You don't have to report it, but I will say, if you have been or were strangled in your domestic violence, the chances of that having a lethal outcome are 750% higher than someone that wasn't strangled or choked in that relationship. So if that's your scenario, you can still get that checked out medically, get that documented, and make sure that's part of the court record, because every judge should understand that lethality connection. They don't always, but again, that's a thing your lawyer can educate on.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so sorry that we're running out of time, but Liz, can you tell people how to find you?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can email me at info@safenest.org and just say, hey, I've got a question, or I've got a question for Liz, and we'll make sure we get back to you. And we will eventually post this when we get the recording on our website. So you can reach us anytime at info@safenest.org.
Thank you so much. And sorry, it took a few tries to get going, but really
Thank
appreciate
you.
your coming on. And those statistics are astonishing and upsetting, but I think there's more to this conversation. So let's not make it the last.
Thank you.
All right, take care. Bye.
Bye.